Welcome to Cloudy with a Chance of Trust, a podcast for digital transformation leaders where we discuss the latest cyber attack issues, enterprise security strategies, and current security events so that you can successfully accelerate network and security transformation. And now, here's what's on our mind this week.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Cloudy with a Chance of Trust. I'm your host, Pam Kubiatowski, and I'm so glad you're joining me today. It's really exciting as we are being listened to in over 50 countries in the world, which is so appropriate for today's conversation, as I'm so excited to actually welcome Zscaler's advisor, one of our advisors, and CTO of South Africa's largest bank, Andrew Baker. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you very much. That's a scary statistic, 50 countries. Wow.
It's amazing. Andrew is a technology blogger with more than 40,000 LinkedIn followers, which blows my mind, 40,000. And he's actually a sought-after speaker on topics including cybersecurity, fraud, zero trust strategies, cloud, and distributed ledger technology. He joins us actually from South Africa. And before we jumped on, Andrew was telling us, interestingly enough, that they're having, is it minor rolling blackouts in South Africa, Andrew? Could you give our listeners, because we did have some challenges getting on here with Andrew this morning.
Yes. Yeah, it was. Look, it's not a new thing. It's been in the country for a little while. It's definitely has peaks and troughs, and now we're in a bit of a peak. And so for a number of hours a day, like I think at the moment it's about 5 or 6 hours a day, they turn the power off in different regions. You know, so yeah, I went before the call. I have to run around and make sure there's a signal in the room and swap between devices, and I had a bit of gymnastics, but apparently it will be fixed at some point. So,
but a couple years yet to go.
I think so. Yeah.
I think it makes it very interesting for technology leaders to figure out how do you keep the business running when you have challenges such as rolling power outages. But coming back, we are going to actually discuss your career and your experience with zero trust implementations, and actually what it means to be a CTO in a heavily regulated banking industry. But before we dive in, Andrew, to your background and so forth, okay, for our listeners, what is a distributed ledger?
Okay, so like I guess one of the things you have to do if you're CTO is the emerging technology comes up and you have to start researching it. It's your job. So it shouldn't be a case of getting a load of consultants in to create PowerPoint to show your organization, you know, what this new technology can do. And I guess you could look at AI as the current thing that people are excited about. About 5, 6, maybe even longer years ago, everyone got super excited about distributed ledger technology. Initially, it came from blockchain. And so blockchain is part of that family. There were a number of challenges with blockchain technology. For example, it kind of taps out at about 7 transactions a second. So that, you know, that's not a good throughput for a global payment platform. And so this family of technologies came out called distributed ledger technologies, and they tried to take the heart of blockchain principles and apply it with different choices of technology. And that whole family, Ethereum is a distributed ledger, blockchain is and there's many different variants for that. And some of the properties that they exhibit, they're supposed to be censorship resistant. And as the name suggests, it's a bunch of distributed ledgers that talk to each other and coordinate transactions, typically through something like it's called proof of work or proof of stake. And eventually they come up with a consensus. So it's a fascinating technology. It hasn't had the impact that people have thought that it could have had yet. And there are a number of technical obstacles to it, particularly around consistency. So yeah, I think that one of my predictions for distributed ledger technology is the thing that it could solve actually is digital identity. And so we're really focused on payment and store of value, but actually there's a company called Sovereign, or it's actually a foundation called Sovereign Foundation, and they're focused on using distributed ledger technology to solve your digital identity. And for me, that is probably one of the most compelling use cases, and it actually fits very nicely within zero trust as well. One of the things you still have to solve in a zero trust network is who is that, and self-sovereign identity or SSI is a very, very emergent solution for that.
That's very interesting. Now that we kind of have an idea, tying back into blockchain and the technology behind it, let's kind of pivot and talk about your career. You have a very interesting background, and it spans multiple disciplines. Can you briefly take us through your career and how you ultimately became the CTO?
Yeah, how I ultimately became a CTO is a really interesting. I don't know if I can answer that question, but I can certainly talk you through the career. There was no planning to my career at all. So there's never been a drive to elevate. I haven't had that desire to be more senior. In my head, it always feels like it will be more painful to become more senior. So that wasn't a drive. I've always been seduced by complexity, definitely. I've always favored going after complicated problems. And so I started off as a civil engineer. Actually, my very first job was in a butcher's cleaning industrial freezers when I was about 11 or 12 years old. So I've been working my whole life, but my first postgraduate job was a civil engineer, and I used to write models, finite difference models. And this was, I used to write the software myself, because it would take like 500 pages of calcs to do that. And I really enjoyed that. And I was talking to a recruitment agent who I knew, and he said, you should go and work for a bank. And so they convinced me that I should work for a bank, and I went for the interview there. And I started work with Chase Manhattan, who was bought out by JP Morgan, and I was doing something called sector bump analysis. I was analyzing baskets of derivatives to see what their value would do as the market moves around. Then I'm going to compress this, then I moved into and that's quite a complicated problem because there wasn't really distributed technologies available. So I had to use a technology called DCOM. Please do not Google that. That will definitely show my age. And then I moved into high frequency trading, and I really, really, really enjoyed that. That was an incredibly complex thing to do for about 12 years, and very competitive. And you were kind of competing with the best technologists on the planet at that point in time. And that was a huge amount of fun. What happened was that the company that I was working for, the bank that I was working for at the time, had a lot of problems with payments. And they were like, this HFT stack never went down. It never failed. We never had issues with it. It worked 24/7. We didn't have software update problems. They literally ran 60 exchanges globally with billions of dollars going through it, and not one issue with it. And they're saying, surely you can solve our payments systems. It's got to be similar. So then I started looking at that, and then things went a bit fuzzy, and you got more, and they're like, surely cyber problems are similar to pay. And so you end up like saying, oh yeah, that sounds, and yeah, so I ended up getting seduced into more problems, and before I knew it, I had like a kind of architectural role, which ended up becoming a CTO role at a big bank in Africa. And we were looking after data, payments, I guess really core engineering services for the organization. I don't even remember how that happened. I'm pretty sure I didn't agree to it. I don't remember signing anything, but something happened. Someone did something clever to kind of convince me it was a good idea.
It's before you know it, right? Years have gone by, and you look back and you're like, how did I get here?
Yeah, exactly.
But you took that hands-on, that technical, really engaged, and grew through your career, which I think really adds to how you contribute in your role. Learning on the job, I think, is so important, right? It makes us who we are. And so you actually transitioned to a zero trust framework in not one, not two, but three of your previous organizations. Can you explain a little bit of why you thought zero trust was the right call in each of those instances?
Then there should be a disclaimer before I do that. So my very first project was to exit Zscaler. So, because I didn't see the value in it. So I was like, okay, this we should get this out, right? What is it actually doing for us? But as you point out, I'm fairly hands-on. So I just wanted to understand, like, what is the value of this? It wasn't used it wasn't used as I evolved it. So the way it was being used in the organization, it was just being used on the Wi-Fi. So that's why I was kind of targeting, let's get this out. Like, what the heck have we got this thing on our Wi-Fi for? But as I started to unpack it, I was like, oh, it does that. And the penny started to drop on me. I was like, I'm developing, and these DLP agents running on my MacBook are like zapping through 60% of the resources on my box. And I'm like, this is painful. And then this other antivirus software is going to grab another 30% of it. And then the EDR grabs the last little bit, and I get like 2% left to do some work with. And it occurred to me that a zero trust network architecture should be, and the other thing is, like, you can abuse any technology, but that combined with a proper strategy around how you have data, how you lay out your network, how you segregate, that would be a very powerful tool by itself, actually, in reducing a whole ton of risks. So I went to take it out, and I ended up pivoting and saying, actually, so I also had other bits of data. I had like a cyber audit for a VPN. And the list of if anyone wants to know why you should have a zero trust network, go audit your VPN. You've probably got a flat network behind it. It will scare the life out of you how easy it is to work through a VPN and take an entity out. And as soon as you bring something like Zscaler in, it does a load of other really nice things. And here's another little consequence of it. So, very short story. I remember writing an algorithm that went live after something called MiFID in the UK, and it was making a significant sum of money each day. And I got a little congratulatory email from someone very seen in the back, and I was like, "That's pretty cool. I'm really happy with that." Somebody else rolled out a version upgrade for BlackBerry, right? So this is a little while ago, and the whole organization erupted with euphoria. Like, wow, the internet actually works on my BlackBerry. And I just thought, how unfair, that I did all this work and it's making all this money, and someone does a version bump on BlackBerry and they're like getting carried out on the shoulders. And Zscaler has that same uplift, right? If you actually roll it out properly, the uplift for your colleagues is massive. They're going on holiday and they're trying to VPN back so they can get onto the network to get to office, which is in the US, and this whole traversing and hairpinning the globe to get to SaaS services. And you go on Zscaler and they're like, wow, it works. Or they open a new office in a new country and they're like, this works. So you end up looking like you're really clever and really awesome just by dropping an agent on the endpoint of your laptops.
You made a point about the VPN. One of the things in my former role, and our listeners know, I was before I came to Zscaler, I was on the customer side and spent my whole career on the customer side in various roles. And one of the things in my last role that scared me was with the VPN is we did not know if anyone was in the network. How do you know someone's in your network that shouldn't be in your network until something alerts you of something? And by that point, how long have they been there? And where did they go? And what have they touched? And what did they leave? And you're sitting in war rooms, right, trying to figure all that out, because to your point, most networks are flat,
yes,
right? Or using VLANs or ACLs or firewalls. And let's face it, a lot of times firewalls are Swiss cheese anyhow.
Yes.
So I can totally relate with that.
But on that point, it's even more profound than that. What people might not appreciate is that most companies tier their system. So they have a tier 1 and they throw a bunch of cyber tools at it. They go, this is tier 1, we must protect that. Then they go down to tier 3, tier 2, tier 3, because they haven't got enough money to put these tools everywhere. So they say, we're in the NOC or the SOC, we will alert if someone touches this tier 1. But the thing is, if you're going to hack, you're not going to tier 1 straight away, right? You're going to go to tier 3 and you're going to dwell there and watch that flow on this flat network for as long as possible. And I was actually talking to some senior people, and they were saying, like, we should have different tiering from a cyber perspective. And that's the other thing, the beauty of Zscaler. You don't need to do that. Everyone sits in the same tier, in the same band, with the same policies and the same enforcement. You don't just say, this is a high risk user, I'm gonna do this, that, and the other with them. The big problem with the dwell time on a flat network is most of the cyber defenses are tiered. And so your point is spot on. They can sit somewhere for ages undetected, looking at tier 1 assets.
So when you look at the organizations you've done this in, and you've rolled out Zero Trust, again, connecting, when you think about, it's the least privileged access, right? Making sure who should be able to see and connect to something. What were some of the challenges and lessons learned? And were they unique to each of those organizations, or were they similar across the board, what you found?
That's a good question. I've got a couple of rabbit holes to go down to answer that one. So if you, I worked at AWS for a little while, and they've embedded Zero Trust in their organization. It's kind of in their DNA, right? So that's what you want for most organizations, but unless you're a hyperscale cloud provider, you're probably not going to be there. So what challenges of going from being essentially born again into Zero Trust, to be born in it, to know it and only live in it is one thing, right? You get used to it. But if you built your whole stack on a flat network and you say, okay, I'm going to start segmenting, I'm going to start carving these things up, it generates a bunch of issues, and I can talk through a few of them. Fantastically, ZDX really helps with that, actually, right? So that is one of the real differentiated parts of the Zscaler suite, is actually having some level of telemetry. I saw the recent announcement about the machine learning to say, hey, this is what's going on in your place. The enforcement side of it is just as fascinating as the actual kind of QoS and network routing for me as well. The first people that will dislike Zscaler quite a lot, or any Zero Trust network architecture, is software developers. And that's not because they have an issue with Zero Trust. It actually just comes down to cert pinning. Almost all of the services that they use, like AWS's CLI or PIP or anything that they use, Java, for example, when they run those things, they will have to insert the Zscaler or whatever the product is, the cert onto that product, because most of the tools and utilities that we use do not use keychain, and so that creates a lot of pain. If you have 10 versions of Java, you've got to do it times 10. So the first person to start moaning, and what you shouldn't do as an organization, is start bypassing. So the devs will come to you and say, hey, I can't get AWS because it's giving me this cert error. The temptation is just go, well, there's a bypass rule. Off you go. You can carry on. I'd watch that very, very carefully. You're doing you're bringing a firewall. You're making a Zscaler firewall, and you're starting to drill those holes in it and bypass those policies. So in general, we are focused on writing scripts that will just put the cert wherever it should be, and that's definitely something that would be a very valuable addition, from an on-ramp perspective. The colleagues in the organization feel good. Like it blows their mind. Like how do I dial in to Zscaler? It's a bit like, remember when we had those dial-up internet things? I don't know if that was, and it used to make that.
Yes, you are dating us, Andrew. Yes.
It used to make that terrible screaming sound, and and you get onto, what was it, AOL or something. You're like, yep. And that's kind of like a VPN, right? People. Those of you who haven't been on Zero Trust network architecture, you're in the dial-up internet world where you just don't realize it right now, right? So your internet is from a backhaul to your head office, and it's not a good place for your organization or your staff to be. So they love Zscaler. They're like, and I opened my laptop and Outlook worked. Mm-hmm. And it's like semi-euphoric. Like, right. I can get emails without going through a two-factor, and they're like, is it even safe? They're like often saying, I'm not sure if this is safe, those, I think if people left a company that had a Zero Trust network architecture and had to go back to a VPN, there'd be like a big slump in their morale. So the staff in general love Zscaler. They love, once you get it set up, from a rollout perspective, I approached it the same way each time.
Mm.
And that wasn't a mistake. I've definitely seen people get that wrong. So if you are overzealous in your boundaries that you want to bring in, you will create a lot of harm. And what happens is any organization has an appetite for outages. They have a budget, if you want to look at it that way. If you start chewing through that by putting going from zero segmentation to like segmenting down at like a serverless level, you are going to cause absolute carnage. So our general principle would be to copy the existing boundaries, actually, day one, and get the thing working and get everyone comfortable with it. And then what we do is each day we'd make a small policy change. Say, who is using this asset? That's the first question. Put them in a group, right? And create an onboarding process for anyone else who wants to do it. That's not a pervasive change. That's not going to cause outages, and it's a fairly easy to manage. And then we go, by the way, should they be in the group? Right. And so there's a little bit of change management. And if you do it that way, you should roll out. I mean, I've rolled out in companies with 40,000 people or 20,000 people. You should be targeting a rollout in 3 months. That should be where your head is. You might not get there, but budget that window. And then you should like right size, and you shouldn't start stripping out security controls during the rollout. Like Zscaler will sit side, other than a VPN, you can VPN over Zscaler if you have to, but keep that flexibility, allow staff to exit Zscaler to turn it off, right? And then ask them, why did you do that? And then fix it. And so we hardened it afterwards, after the rollout, and it was a very low impact in terms of friction and, sort of outages or accidental intent, I guess.
So Andrew, you hit on a couple key points. Number one, you dated both of us in our age. No, but so many of us were, when you went from a old technology and you converted to a new technology, you do the scream test, right? And the listeners know we've talked about the scream test before. You flip the old technology off, you flip the new one on, and you wait to see, does anyone scream? Did you break anything? Yeah. I think when you've highlighted a point of, when you move to the right zero trust architecture, you're able to live in a coexistent manner and actually deploy it very tactically. Let's face it, many organizations have developers, and developers are so important to the organizations, and yet they want as much freedom as possible to do what they need to do to advance the business, right? So how do you do that safely, securely, and ultimately give them flexibility? And going back to your point, you said it so nicely. It's about the flexibility of the architecture to be able to continuously optimize it and get to where you ultimately want to be from a zero trust perspective. So many are if or that, right? And more stringent about how you get there. So moving on, and you being in South Africa, right? I'm sure, and being in the banking industry, the U.S. for us, really our banking industry right now is really under a microscope, right? There have been some recent high-profile collapses here. Is the situation similar in South Africa? And what's the unique pressure you're all feeling in the banking industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's broader than the US. We've obviously seen a Swiss bank also go into distress. It looks like a couple of German banks might be suffering. So I think fundamentally we're all the same. Like the interest rate hike, I wouldn't say it caught anyone by surprise, because kind of everyone knows it's not going to stay so low forever. Yeah, I think the speed at which it went up might have caught some institutions off guard, and I guess ultimately the end consumer that we lend into, they could easily have been caught off guard as well, and then you can definitely see absolutely globally strain, not just with inflation as well, but the whole economics. Banks are just a service, a service provider to the broader economy. So if the economy is doing great, typically the banks are doing well as well. And if they're not, then the converse is true. So yes, we have the exact same problems that everywhere else has. The regulatory structure in South Africa is slightly different. It is quite conservative, and I think that does help when the economy is not in a good place. So I don't hear of and there's also not as many banks, so we have like probably 5 big banks. Their balance sheets are super healthy, but at the end of the day, it's a pressure, right? So whether it's an existential pressure, we can debate that. But for certain, every single one of the banks globally now, I can't imagine a bank that's waking up in the morning going, yeah, it's going to be a cracking year.
Right.
And I don't think we're exempt from that.
So bringing this all together here, what advice would you offer a peer who's either embarking on their zero trust transformation or considering to do so?
The things that I think should force you to think more seriously about that, and certainly where I am right now, there's a absolute almost like pandemic level of hacking going on, and it used to be smaller institutions, but that's kind of building up into bigger and bigger institutions. And so government entities are a target. You see that obviously the war has created quite a lot of hacking activity as well. And so the first view is you've got pressure, you've got financial pressure, we understand that, but you have to be a bank. Right. And in order to be a bank, you need to make sure that you are safe and that you're not burning trust and that you're not dealing either with data loss, which can come because your staff are under pressure. Maybe they're in financial distress and there might be pressure on them to repay their loan. And you see that, right? You Google it and you can see that colleagues within banks are potentially selling their data or accidentally installing software that is like leaking the organization's data. So the first thing is like, you don't want to be in that movie as an organization. You want to have, it's a very hard thing to stop data loss is the first thing, but it's not a great thing to be in this environment right now where you're spilling your customers' information on the internet. The next thing is, I'd say probably bigger than that, you could argue, is there is a lot of federated workforce now, post-COVID. And we still, even my organization right now has a kind of in the office 3 days a week, and that's great. But we also want that flexibility, and we see that there's productivity associated with that. Putting those colleagues at home at the end of a VPN is not only a bad experience, but you're going through their network to get there. And I would argue that is not a great position for your organization to be in with the amount of threats that are going on right now. So yeah, I would say if you're thinking about it, like just you have to think about things like ransomware as well. Like I worked in a company where we bought ransomware protection. So we took, I think it was about 8 petabytes of storage, and we had to figure out how to duplicate that in on all the deltas and whatever to cover for ransomware. Zscaler removes a huge portion of that risk. You take your end user estate essentially away from your data center, you segment them. And so I would say that if you look at all your projects, you're never going to stop doing cyber work, especially in this environment that we sit in right now. I can't think of a project that would deliver you more organizational health and more risk out than a zero trust network architecture.
And that's really for any industry. I mean, let's face it. Everything you just covered is for really any industry out there, because you see various industries all being attacked. The attacks are getting worse. And I think the other point you kind of made, and I want to pull out a little bit, is I think so many thought for so many years that I'll just keep piling on more and more cybersecurity tools. I'm just going to keep adding to the arsenal. In my own previous experience, I found that once you start unraveling all those various tactical solutions you layered on, that actually left vulnerabilities that we didn't really realize we had because it became so complicated to operationalize everything. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and they actually fight with each other. So the tools start wrestling with each other. For CPU, for resources, if there's a file that they don't like. My preference is, and it's a personal preference, I am a fan of EDRs. I think there's definitely a space for that. And if I think about my cyber stack, and a zero trust network architecture. And then I'm kind of done, right? So there is a little spot for DLP when you start thinking about USBs being plugged. Our cyber estate is very focused and very targeted. It is not spray and pray. I think there's a lot. What we also do as well, and this is a really something I'd recommend people to do, is we test hypothesis. So we say, okay, we've got all these cyber tools, right? Can I accidentally leak data? Let's test that. So we have people that will try and exfiltrate that and so we've come up with some really interesting internal strategies to spot that. And funny enough, we actually found somebody was doing it by mistake, because we injected a record into a database that wasn't a real person, and we found that record leaving that colleague's device. And so put your tools in, don't spray and pray, and then start flexing it and saying, will it stop this? And you go, yeah, I expect it to, and prove it. And will the knock, for example, if you've got a knock or something, do they even see the alerts? I was in a company that was generating close to about 30,000 alerts a day. And they had an event, and somewhere in those 30,000 alerts was definitely something saying, this is a problem, but they couldn't process that amount. So as soon as you start not just operationalizing it, like the signal to noise ratio of all these tools with all these different policies means that if there is something going on, you're probably not going to see it.
I just love that. And we're going to leave our listeners with that last thought. Don't spray and pray, right? Don't spray and pray. Love that. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a great conversation, a little insight into South Africa's banking industry and some of the challenges that are there, and how Andrew has actually worked through them in multiple organizations. With that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. I also want to remind you, if you have not heard and if you have not signed up yet, please, Zenith Live, Zscaler's annual user conference is quickly approaching. It'll be held this year in the Americas in Las Vegas, which was there last year too. For those of you who joined us, we had a great event last year, and we're looking forward to this year. On June 12th through the 15th, it'll be held at the Aria Resort and Casino. And for EMEA, we are actually going to be in Berlin, Germany this year at the Intercontinental, June 27th through the 29th. We hope that you can all join us who's listening out there. It'll be both events are going to be phenomenal, and great content, phenomenal speakers, and actual customers that will be able to help show you how their journey changed their organizations. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Cloudy with a Chance of Trust. Check back with your podcast provider regularly for more episodes. You can find Lisa Lorenzen and Pam Kubiatowski on the CXO Revolutionaries website at revolutionaries.zscaler.com or on LinkedIn. Statements by Zscaler podcasters and guests are informational only and should never be construed as legal advice. You should consult with your legal advisor on matters related to you or your business. Zscaler makes no warranties, express, implied, or statutory as to the content of this podcast, and it is provided as is. Content on this podcast may contain forward-looking statements that are current as of the date of recording and subject to change. These statements are subject to the safe harbor provisions created by the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995. Full legal disclaimers are available at revolutionaries.zscaler.com. Copyright 2022.